This morning I want to take you back in the Old Testament to Genesis chapter 31. Back in the Old Testament here in Genesis 31, we have an episode in the life of Jacob and Jacob's family. And in this passage that we're going to look at this morning, Jacob is making some changes in his life. Now these changes come about what would have been in that time probably around what would later be known as the Jewish New Year. At this time in history, this was before the Jewish people had their calendar, before they had a new year. But this would have been early in the spring, which is when the Jewish New Year starts. Also, this is a passage in which Jacob is making some drastic changes in his life. In the life of Jacob, as he was a boy growing up, he had a relatively stable family environment to grow up in. His family were nomad shepherds and herdsmen, but they were very stable during the early years of his life. However, as a young man, Jacob made some decisions that caused him to have to run for his life. And he wound up fleeing from the land where he was raised and going north several hundred miles to live with some distant relatives and to where he wound up marrying his wives. Wives is plural in this case. And so he stayed there in this land that he had left to go to as a fugitive. He stayed there for 20 years. For 14 of those years, he worked as an indentured servant, working to buy his wives and to pay off the debt that he accumulated in procuring his wives. You see, in their culture, in their time in history, wives or girls were sold instead of simply the way we go about our engagements and our marriage processes today. And so Jacob bought his wives and he worked off the debt to pay for his wives for 14 years. For the next 6 years, he worked for his father-in-law as a servant to his father-in-law, receiving wages in the form of livestock for the work that he had produced during those years. And as he received livestock as a way of compensating him for his labor during those 6 years, the livestock that he received increased and grew, and he actually became very wealthy during 6 years as a servant to his father-in-law. And he had a lot of livestock of his own at the end of that 6 years. He had sheep and goats and camels and donkeys, and he even had servants of his own that worked for him. But early in chapter 31, we had seen there in the last Wednesday night that the Lord had talked to Jacob. And Jacob had listened to the Lord speaking to him, and the Lord had told him it was time for him to leave this land, this foreign land that he lived in, and it was time for him to go back home where he was raised. Go back where his father was still alive, to go back to the land that God had promised to give to Abraham and all of his descendants. And Jacob was one of those descendants, or at least those descendants of faith. And Jacob was certainly that descendant of faith. And so Jacob talked to his wives and he told them, it's time for us to go back to the land where I was raised. It's time for me to go home, and the Lord has spoken to me. And so we're going to take all of our children, and we're going to take our livestock and our servants, and we're going to move back south to the land of Canaan where I was raised. Now, if we were going to move today, we would get trucks or trailers, and we would load up our belongings on those trucks and trailers, and we would make the drive to where we were going, and we would unload all of those possessions, and we would be there just in a short matter of time. When Jacob moved, he was moving with hundreds of head of livestock and dozens of people. Many of the livestock that they were carrying with them had offspring, young lambs and young kids with them. And so they would have to travel very, very slowly in order that they did not stress the young animals for them to die. And they wanted to also go slowly so that the ones that were still bearing offspring, that they would have an easier time as well. But as they prepare to leave and as they go, they don't just take what's theirs with them. Now think about that just for a moment. As they prepare to go and as they leave, they don't just take what's theirs with them. Now Jacob would take what was his, and he would be honest in all of his dealings, but his wife Rachel would not. Now we've just left the year 2019 and we've just entered the year 2020. How many of you remember some of the predictions that you've heard for the last 20 years about the changes that would be, or certain statistics that would happen by the year 2020? You know, when I was growing up, we heard about all of these things that were going to happen by the year 2000. There would be all of these different changes and all of this different life that would be possible by the year 2000. Well, then in the year 2000, the predictions were looking forward to what would be different by the year 2020. And looking over the last 20 years, we can see a lot of changes in the last 20 years of life. Now the predictions are for the year 2050. That's the next big number that the predictions are made. But a lot of us, as we look back over the last year, we can see areas in our life that we're not very satisfied with, can't we? We can see things in our life that we would like to see done differently. Changes we'd like to make either personally or physically, emotionally, financially, or otherwise. And so those changes are simply the basis for a lot of our New Year's resolutions, or a lot of our wish to do better during the coming year. And as Jacob was now ready to leave with his family, the land where he had been for the last 20 years, he wanted some changes made. And he had made changes himself during his last 20 years. But he wanted some changes made in his dealings, in who he worked for. He was going to work for himself now and not work for his father-in-law as a boss. He was going to be his own shepherd and not shepherd someone else's livestock. He wanted to be able to call his own shots on every area of life rather than having to consult with a boss and someone else. But he also wanted to go to a land in which God had promised to give to him and to his children after him. And so we're going to begin reading in Genesis 31, verse 17. Then Jacob rose and set his sons and his wives on camels, and he carried away all his livestock and all his possessions which he had gained, his acquired livestock which he had gained in Padan Aram, to go to his father Isaac in the land of Canaan. Jacob was ready to make a break. He was ready to get out of there, to leave that land where he had been, there in what is today modern-day Syria and Iraq in the north of Israel. He was ready to leave there and go back to where modern-day Israel is. And so he had these camels ready for his wives and his children. He had the servants that worked for him ready to get all of the sheep and all the goats and all the donkeys and the other camels ready to go in the caravan. He had servants that were ready to help to pack up their tents and their belongings and everything that they would need to pack. And they were ready to go and ready to make this break. Ready for a new life. Ready for new territory. Ready to take the blessings that God had given them and to take them and to go somewhere else and to see those blessings continue to increase and continue to build and grow because they were being faithful and obedient to the command of God. When we're faithful and obedient to the commands of God, the blessings that He gives may not always look like we think blessings should look, but I can promise you, as long as you're faithful and obedient to God's commands, He's going to bless you. Those blessings, like I said, may not look the way you think they should look, but you will be blessed by God when you're faithful to Him. You will be blessed by Him in great ways, greater ways than you could have ever imagined when you're faithful to Him. When you do things according to God's command, according to His law, according to His will, and according to the revelation that we have in Scripture, you will see blessings that will just amaze you at each and every day. Jacob was ready to see God bless him in even greater ways than he had already been blessed. And he had been blessed in very, very great ways. But look at verse 19. Now Laban, that would be his father-in-law, Rachel's dad. Now Laban had gone to shear sheep, and Rachel had stolen the household idols that were her father's. Did I just hear somebody catch their breath over here? I heard that. I thought I did. And that's a very, very good response. Out of all the ways that God had blessed Jacob and his family, out of giving Jacob the sons that he had so desperately wanted, even his wife Rachel, who's implicated in this passage as being a thief and an idolatrous person, God had even blessed her with a child that she so desperately wanted. And He had heard and answered her prayers. And now, even though she had been blessed in such a great way, as they're preparing to leave, she's going to drag some of the old baggage, the old sin, the old bondage along with her. You know, so many of us entering this new year are a whole lot like Rachel, aren't we? You know, we've got those habits, those thoughts, those misdeeds, those sins, just to put it bluntly, in which we failed during the last year. And every time we failed in those ways during this past year, we just hate it, don't we? We don't like that at all. We'll grumble at ourselves. We'll feel bad. We'll kick ourselves. We'll go to God in prayer and we'll confess and say, God, I'm sorry I failed you again. Please forgive me. Please help me not to do that. And before the day's over, we've done it again. Anybody else been there? Or is it just me? We've done that, haven't we? And now we've entered this new year. And we've entered the year 2020, and we know how weak we are personally. We know how much we fail personally. We know how prone we are just to sin. And we don't want to. You know, our heart tries to be right before the Lord. Our minds want to be right before the Lord, but sometimes it seems as if we just can't help it. And you see Rachel much like that. She was living with a man who was now one of the greatest men of faith from this point on in his life. She was living with a man, her husband, who was one of the great heroes of faith for all generations since, including us today, over 3,000 years later. She had seen God hear and answer prayers. She had seen her family blessed with children and now with a great accumulation of livestock, a great accumulation of wealth. And she had known that God would speak to her family personally. And yet, when it was time for them to leave that land where she had been raised, when it was time for her to leave that place where she had seen so much sin, where she had seen so much deceit, where she had seen so many falsehoods and deceptions and lies, where she had seen people steal and kill and rob and take advantage of one another, now that it was time for her to leave, she just couldn't help it. Her dad was away off, about 3 days away, off where some of his other livestock were, helping with the spring shearing of the sheep. And she goes into her dad's tent, getting ready to leave. And y'all know, many of y'all have moved, and you get ready to pack up and leave, and you look around, is there anything else I need to take with me this time? Is there anything I need to take with me? Anything I can leave, anything I need to take? And she goes over to her dad's tent, and probably had been there many times during her childhood and now even in her adult years. And she sees, even though her dad's a pagan and an idol worshiper, and she has seen the difference in a family that follows God and a family that follows idols, she sees her dad's idols over there in that tent. And she kind of looks over her shoulder. Nobody's watching. And she goes over there and she takes her dad's idols, false gods. She takes them, she hides them under her dress. She carries them back to her tent, and she puts them in her bags of luggage that she's taking on their journey. A lot of us are just like Rachel. We know the blessings of God when we're faithful to Him. We've seen how God can bless us beyond our wildest imagination. We've seen how God's blessed ourselves personally, our families, our church, our community. Many of us are just like Rachel. We see, we know, we hear, we understand, but we look back at the things of the world and all of the idolatrous and sinful things of the world, things that have formerly given us pleasure, things that we used to enjoy, things that we were probably even taught by others how to do. And even though we know the joys and the blessings of serving God, we reach down and we pick up those things of that old sinful, worldly way of life, and we tuck them up somewhere where nobody can see, and we carry them right along with us. Yes, it's a new year. Yes, we've made resolutions. Yes, we've talked about what we'd like to see different. And yes, we've felt bad every time we've fallen back into those old sinful habits and those old sinful ways of life. And we've hated ourselves and we've hated the sin that we did. But just as the Word of God says, the dog is returned to his vomit and the sow's returned to her wallow, to her mire. And we're like Rachel. We've carried that sin right along with us. Verse 20 says, Jacob stole away, unknown to Laban the Syrian, in that he did not tell him that he intended to flee. And so he fled with all that he had. He arose and crossed the river, headed towards the mountains of Gilead. Jacob thought he had made a clean break, thought he had gotten clean away. He was ready to get away, and he'd gotten 3 days head start. He was ready to get as far away from those that had oppressed him as he could get. He was ready to get as close to the blessings that God was promising as he could get. He wanted to be there where those blessings were. But when someone would go and tell Laban, hey, your son-in-law and all of his possessions are gone, the first thing Laban would do would be go back to his tent and to check his tent. The first thing Laban would do would be not to look to see where Jacob was, but to look to see what was missing out of his own tent. And as Jacob thought he made a clean break, a lot of times when we make those promises or those New Year's resolutions, we think simply in that we've made a clean break. We'll make a New Year's resolution, okay, I'm going to eat right. From now on, I'm only going to, let's make up something, spinach and broccoli, and I'm going to live healthy from now on. And I know that's not healthy living. I'm just using that as a funny example. And what's the very first thing you do? You're driving through town, you get hungry, you pull in at the fast food restaurant, you get that cheeseburger and fries and that great big 48-ounce Coca-Cola or drink, whatever your favorite is, and then you're like, well, I blew it. Well, you didn't make a clean break, did you? Before the week was over, you messed up on that New Year's resolution. Now, that's just a funny example that a lot of people will have happen to them before this week's over. It's just a funny example, but it illustrates a whole lot of the way we make much more serious resolutions, doesn't it? We'll make a promise to God. We'll make a resolution to God. God, I'm going to be in church every Sunday. By the way, Sunday school and church is where you all ought to be. So everybody right now, on the count of 3, make that resolution. I'm going to be in church and Sunday school every Sunday. Right? Now, that was simple, wasn't it? Now, keeping it's not as simple, is it? Keeping that resolution is not as simple. Now, you get a pass if you're sick, but that's the only way. Or, I'm just kidding, okay? Y'all can laugh. It's okay. You don't have to look so sleepy. Thank you. Now, we make those resolutions, though, don't we? We talk about all of those more serious things, and we make those promises to God. God, this year, I'm going to. God, this year I'm going to sing in the choir. God, this year I'm going to be more faithful in my church attendance. God, this year I'm going to go on a mission trip. God, this year I'm going to quit doing these things that I know dishonor you. God, and we talk that way in our prayers. We ask for forgiveness for our sins, but like in Jacob and Rachel's case, sometimes there are those that pursue us with the intent to overtake. Verse 22 says, Laban was told on the 3rd day that Jacob was fled. And verse 23 says, and he took his brethren with him and pursued him for 7 days' journey. And he overtook him in the mountains of Gilead. Now this is January the 5th. We haven't had a whole week into this year yet. On day number 5, Jacob was still ahead. On day number 5, after Jacob had left, he was still outrunning those that would pursue him because of the sin in his family's life. On day number 5, he had still gotten away scot-free and was still running, just like some of you are. You've done good on your promises to God up to day number 5. But what about Monday morning? What about Tuesday morning? What about Friday night? What about those times that are going to come in which that resolution's not as new and shiny as it once was, and our weaknesses are beginning to catch up with us. Much like Laban pursuing Jacob, our weaknesses will catch up with us. The devil knows where your weakest points are, and that's where he's going to hit you at and tempt you at the most often. He knows where you're the weakest at, where you fail the most, where you miss the mark, and he's going to give you every opportunity to fail that he can. And a lot of us are going to be just like Rachel. We're going to fail. We're going to fail in those opportunities. And as that devil continues to pursue us into this new year, having made those promises to God, that are much, much more serious than any fickle New Year's resolution, as that devil continues to pursue us, he continues to hit every one of us where we are the weakest, where we are the most vulnerable, just as Rachel was when she saw those little idols in there in that house, in that tent. And she said, I'm going to take those with me. Now, we're not going to go through the rest of this chapter, but later on in this chapter, where we will get to Wednesday night, we see that as Laban overtook Jacob, he could not accuse Jacob of doing anything wrong. But he asked Jacob, why have you taken my idols? You see, the world is full of sin, and the world wants you to be in sin, but if you're not going to sin, the world wants its sin back. So why have you taken my idols? And Jacob challenges Laban. He said, you can search everything I've got. And if anybody in my camp has taken your idols, they will be put to death. And so Laban does. He searches all of the flocks that Jacob owns. He searches every tent that Jacob's servants and his family have set up. But Rachel keeps the idols hidden under her seat as she's sitting on the saddlebags that go on her camel. Once again, many of us are much like Rachel. We keep those things hidden, even from the most prying eyes. We keep those things hidden where we think we're safe in our sinfulness. We keep those inner thoughts, those inner desires, those bad attitudes, those sinful wishes. We keep them hidden in the deepest, darkest recesses, and we make all the excuses we can of why we cannot give them up. But I want to challenge you this morning. The best thing you can do, if there is any baggage, any sinful bondage that you're dragging into this new year, the very best thing you can do is to give that up. To turn that loose, to let it go, and to make it seen never anymore. These idols would continue to plague the house of Jacob for many years. In chapter 35, we read that God calls Jacob to go back to a very special place called Bethel to go and to pray because God's going to bless him again. And the first thing Jacob has to tell his family is, you take all of your idols and get them out of our camp this time. Jacob knew all along those idols were in their camp. He knew all along his family was living in sin, and Jacob was not man enough to man up to his family and tell them, you get that out of my camp, and you get that out of our family's business. But all of that time, he would continue to allow and condone the sin of idolatry among his family and his servants. Until we get to chapter 35, and he finally tells them when they're camped near a place called Shechem, you take all of your idols and you bring them to me. And it says that they hid them under the terebinth tree. They hid those idols under a tree in chapter 35, but then in chapter 37, Jacob's sons are back in Shechem again in the very place where they hid those idols. The Bible doesn't mention if they dug them up or found them and went back to worshiping those idols, but y'all know how it is, don't you? You know how it is when you wind up back in the same place where you've fallen before, whether that is a physical, geographical location or if that's a place in your mind or your heart. You know how it is, how easy it is to fall again when you're back and you're in that same environment mentally, emotionally, or physically. And we know, just like Jacob knew, that those things do not belong in the house of God or among the people that God has blessed. James chapter 4 and verse 8, we have a command by the writer James in the New Testament about cleansing our lives. James says, draw near to God and He will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. Draw near to God, and He'll draw near to you. What a promise. What a blessing that we have in James chapter 4. Draw near to God and He will draw near to you. That sounds simple, doesn't it? When you are near to God and He is near you, it's going to be that much easier to avoid those failures and sins and temptations, the idols of the past that have held you back from the blessings that God wants to give you. Many of you will do things when no one's watching that you wouldn't do here in church or even in front of certain family members. And when you are that close to God, as James is instructing there in chapter 4 and verse 8, when you are drawing near to God, He's constantly on your mind. When you're drawing near to God, He and His will is what's going to be foremost in your thoughts. When you're drawing near to God and He's drawing near to you, as James instructs us there, then you are going to think about every move you make and every decision you make based on how it's going to look in front of Him, and not just how it's going to gratify some sinful desire and lust of the flesh. Draw near to God and He will draw near to you. But then look in the next part of that verse. Cleanse your hands, you sinners. Oh, we sin with our mind. We sin in our hearts, but we sin with our hands too, don't we? We do things with our hands that would be considered sinful, just as Rachel went and she took those idols. And she took them and then she hid them with her hands, and then she lied about them with her mouth. We're much like Rachel. But He tells us to cleanse your hands. Cleanse your hands, not just with water, but as He says, to purify your hearts, you double-minded. Throughout the short letter that James wrote, he continues to rebuke those who are double-minded. Today we'd call that two-faced. Those who say one thing and live a different way. Those who pretend to be one person while they're at church and then are something else quite differently at home or at work or in private. Cleanse your hearts. Purify your hearts, you double-minded. Come before the Lord with a single heart. Come before the Lord with a single mind, worshiping Him and desiring to live for Him and before Him in Christian honesty and integrity every day of your life. Now, every bit of that is built upon Deuteronomy chapter 6 and verse 5. Deuteronomy chapter 6 and verse 5 is the whole theme for the daily devotionals that I'll be writing this year and sending to anybody that wants them. Oh, yes, we're using different verses each and every day, but it all begins in Deuteronomy chapter 6 and verse 5. For as the Lord Jesus said, this is the first and the greatest commandment. If we don't get the first commandment right in our life, we will not be faithful to keep the rest of the commandments to any degree of success. We will not be able to leave the sin and the bondage and the baggage and the idols of the past behind. We will not be ready to receive the blessings that God has prepared for us in the future if we do not get the first and the greatest commandment right. You shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, and with all your strength. That is a command of God. Did you know love can be commanded? Our society tells us that love is an emotion and people fall in and out of love. That's baloney. Love can be commanded. Love is a decision. Love is a process. And love is commanded by God for us to love God. Now, does God command us to love Him because He's some big egomaniac up in the sky that just wants all of us to fall down humbly before Him? Is His ego so soft and brittled that it needs to be patted by our affections as we come and we show that love to Him? No. For God is above all of those fickle human emotions. But God commands us to love Him because He first loved us. When we are obedient to love Him as He's commanded, then He is faithful to bless us as He's promised. When we are obedient to structure our lives around the love of God, the love for our Creator, when we're obedient to structure our lives around that love for Him as our Creator, then we will see God bless us in greater ways than we even saw in the Old Testament book of Genesis of how He blessed Jacob, who had started off as a fugitive and wound up being the wealthiest man in the world in the day and the time that he lived. Oh, it wasn't simply because Jacob was shrewd and smart and cunning that he accumulated so much so fast. But it was because God blessed him so much in such great ways. When we see in Jacob's life the things that he thought he wanted always turned out to hold him back until he wanted to serve God faithfully. The things that he thought would be the greatest blessings in his life turned out to be some of the things that caused him the most grief in life. Many of us are much the same way. We see things, don't we? And we see those things and we just want them, we desire them, or we covet them, or we lust after them. And we want those things, but often those are the very things that will hold us back from receiving the greater blessings that God would have to give us. The very things that Jacob thought he did not want, the things that he despised at first, were the things that God used to bless him the most. Think of the irony of that. But it's one of the great things in God's economy. For the Lord tells us that if we would seek to save our life ourselves, then we're going to lose our life. But that if we surrender our life to Him, if we lose our life for His sake, that's when we truly gain true and everlasting life. That's when our life is changed for His glory. That's when our life is ready to receive the blessings that He has promised, when we're ready to give our will, our life over to Him and to follow Him faithfully out of a heart of love.